Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining PSHSA's The Workplace Reimagined Virtual Conference. My name is Shannon Hunt. I'm Vice President of Organizational and Operational Excellence here at PSHSA. I'm pleased to welcome you to Coping During COVID, Insights from Leadership Theories, presented by Meredith Woodwork, an assistant professor from the, can you help me with the name again? Sorry. Lazaridis School of Business and Economics at Wilfrid Laurier University. Before we begin, I want to mention that there will be an opportunity to answer a few questions following the presentation. Please feel free to enter your questions in the chat and we will select some time to ask from there. This is an unprecedented time, which will take remarkable leadership for us to emerge stronger. What are some of the strategies that can help us to reset, redefine, and move forward as a leader of ourselves, our workforce, and our businesses during the COVID crisis? Meredith Woodwork is an award-winning teacher of organizational behavior and leadership at the undergraduate and MBA levels at the Lazaridis, thank you, School of Business and Economics at Wilfrid Laurier University. She has taught at universities around the world, including Japan, Russia, and at home in Canada. She has a PhD in business administration from the Ivey Business School, an MBA in strategic management from the Sauder School of Business, and a BA in English and psychology from Dalhousie University. Meredith is the author of many peer-reviewed cases and instructor manuals used in business schools around the world and serves on the editorial board of the Case Research Journal. She is also an experienced certified project manager, PMP, and has worked in the public sector as a senior manager in healthcare, utilities, and higher education, as well as in the private sector as a management consulting specializing in family-run firms. Her professional work focuses on effective change management within large, complex organizations. We are pleased to welcome Meredith, who will share research-based strategies for coping during COVID as a leader using insights from authentic, servant, transformational, and leader-member exchange theories. Hello and welcome, Meredith. I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, Shannon. I really appreciate your invitation, and I'm really delighted to be here with you today. I am delighted also that I have some former MBA students who are with PSHSA, so I'm really delighted to be able to join you. So my talk today is really about we're all here coping with COVID and trying to work through that situation. And I want to provide to you some insights from leadership theory that I think might be nice reminders if they're new, if they're not new to you, but also some of these thoughts might be new to you. So I just want to share some of those with you today, and hopefully there's some nuggets in there for you to think about going forward. I have taken the opportunity today to try out Mentimeter for the very first time. So you guys are my guinea pigs on trying that out. So I'm going to start by asking you to go to on any device that you've got available that you can work on so that you can participate in the polls that I'm going to run. Go to menti.com. It's www.menti.com. And the code that we're using today is 3151277. So menti.com, menti.com. And the code, it'll ask you for a code 3151277. And my first question for you is, do you consider yourself a leader? So you get to put in your answer. And I'll give you a couple of minutes just to, well, not a couple of minutes, a couple more seconds just to get people a chance to participate if they would like to. So again, if you haven't had a chance to join yet, you can join at menti.com, menti.com, and the code is 3151277. All right. So there are other questions coming, but I wanted to get a sense of where people are at in the audience today. So do you consider yourself a leader is the question on the table right now. I didn't give you a ton of choices. All right, I'm going to say going once, going twice, and I think I will close the voting on this one, and so we can move along. So looks like we've got lots of people in the room or in the virtual room who consider yourselves leaders, which is great. And some of you are sort of on the fence about it. Some of you aren't there yet, or you don't think that that's sort of where you're at yet, which is fine. Leaders need followers too, right? So and being a follower is as you get to lots of exposure with other leaders, you get to learn a lot about leadership as well. So that's great. I just wanted to get a sense of where everybody's at. And my next question for you, and I will point out that by the end of the presentation, you might have a different take on your answer there too. So keep that in mind for later. My next question for you is, as a leader, to the extent that you feel you are a leader or not, how challenging has COVID been for you personally? And so I've got a scale from way less than usual, same as usual, more than usual, or way more than usual. So think back to sort of where you were before COVID hit and what life was like for you as a leader. Relative to that sort of state of normal affairs, how challenging has COVID been for you personally? I'll give people a couple more seconds to participate here. All right, going once, going twice. So close the voting. Okay, so thanks for giving me a sense of where you guys are at. It seems like most of us, as I anticipated, are finding that COVID's more challenging than usual. Not everybody, of course. Some of us are about same old, but most people, I think, are finding that this is a really challenging situation to navigate for a variety of reasons. And we're going to look at more specifics about why that is in a bit. But so my goal today is really to, I think that what people are feeling is that there's a lot of challenge and kind of leadership chaos, that a lot of the normal order of things has been upended. And it feels like, it can feel a lot like chaos and disorder, and that can feel very disorienting for a lot of people. So my goal for today is really to give you a couple of nuggets from leadership theory to think about, sort of digestible nuggets to think about, to help make the sort of chaos and disorder that you may be feeling a little bit more ordered, provide a little bit more structure and a little bit more digestible nuggets for you to think through, and just key messages from leadership theory. So hopefully it'll provide some food for thought as you move through your leadership week and your leadership months as we go through. So where I'd like to start is to talk about the fact that leadership's got different levels, right? And most of leadership theory will tell you that leadership starts with managing yourself first and foremost. And I think that's one of my first very key messages for all leaders throughout challenging situations is you've got to take care of yourself. It's like in the airplane, you got to put your own mask on first. You can't lead without your own oxygen. So you do need to make sure that you're managing yourself and taking care of yourself first. It's a really important point for you to be able to then lead others and lead organizations and lead, to the extent that we may be doing that as well, lead change in our organizations or lead change in our societies, all of which is going on simultaneously. So don't forget about yourself as you're leading through and concerned about others and organizations and society and whatnot. You need to put your own mask on first, so to speak. I'd like to start with a pretty common definition of leadership. If you Google leadership definitions, you will get thousands of different answers, but they have a lot in common. This is one that I use. It comes from Dr. Peter Northouse, who's a famous leadership theoretician. And he defines leadership as a process where an individual influences a group of individuals to achieve a common goal. So it's a process is one of the key messages, first of all. So it implies that there's an interaction component to it, of course, and where individuals are trying to influence others to achieve some sort of common goal. It could be a goal, but sometimes it's also to work towards a common purpose of some sort. But most definitions of leadership will give you those kinds of components. There's a component about being a process, about influencing and influencing others, and some sort of common goal or common purpose that people have. So one of the things that's interesting is that it also implies that, as you know, leadership is not a position, right? Leadership is really about activities and actions and the things that we do each and every day to try to manage our organizations and try to get goals accomplished and what's it. So it's not a position, but it really, which is why I think so many of you probably answered that you do consider yourself a leader in some capacity. Regardless of whether your position is officially termed a leader, you may be acting and influencing others in a leadership capacity. So the key traditional tasks of leadership are really managing tasks and managing relationships. We manage tasks in order to get goals accomplished, right? To get things done in organizations. That's one of the key things we have to do. We have to, do the project management stuff. We have to define what the tasks are. We have to order them and schedule them and whatnot. But the other thing that we do as leaders is we have to influence others in order to get that work done. And that influence is really done through relationships. It's through building relationships and managing relationships and developing relationships over time. So the key sort of tasks in any kind of leadership role are the managing the task components and managing the relationship components. And we do both of them. Sometimes we focus on one more than the other for a certain period of time. Sometimes we have to focus on the other more. And some of us are more comfortable in one side than the other. But regardless, both of those components are important for our success as leaders. One very intuitive theory about leadership that I like is called path goal theory. And path goal theory basically argues that a leader's job is to clear the path to the goal for their followers or subordinates, whatever you want to call them, so that they can achieve their goal. So leaders are people who remove obstacles, they clear up any pitfalls that are on the path towards accomplishing the goal, and they support and guide their followers or their subordinates through. Leaders also define what the goal is, they help define and clarify what the path to the goal is, and they adapt their behaviors for managing those tasks and relationships as you go through the process. So one of the key things about thinking about leadership as a process is that it's something that occurs over time, right? It's something that is ongoing on a daily basis over time. Another theory that I think is really important for understanding leadership is called situational theory. Situational theory basically argues that any given leader has to, in any leadership interaction, they have to decide to what extent should I be directive in terms of telling people what they need to be doing? Should I be very directive or only somewhat directive? And to what extent should I be supportive? Should I be highly supportive or do it only need to be somewhat supportive? And the balance of those two. So this is the 2x2 model that basically says there's 4 different fundamental ways in which leaders can behave based on different combinations of being supportive and being directive. So the first one is when you're high on directive and low on supportive behaviors. That's really called the directive style. And it's really about and it's very appropriate at certain times when people are new or when people are lost. And then when you're balancing both high supportive and high directive behaviors, they call that the coaching style. So you're being both directive to help people through, but you're also being very highly supportive because people typically are learning at this phase. The next stage is the supporting stage, which is when you can take your foot off the gas a little bit in the direction side because people are developing and getting more comfortable in their roles, making good progress towards the goal. You still need to be highly supportive, but you can be less directive. And then the last one is when you've got highly developed people in your team, and you don't need to be highly directive or highly supportive at this point. But you can be there in both domains when they need you. So it's kind of a developmental stage model, which I think is important to keep in mind. You always need to think about where your followers are at and what they need at any given time. So those are sort of some fundamental background thoughts about leadership theory, independent of COVID. So in walks COVID at the end of 2019, and it really started influencing us here in Canada in early 2020. But COVID threw us all for a loop in a lot of different ways. And I want to give you a way of thinking about this event and this period of time in terms of leadership theory. And in terms of leadership theory, we call an event like this an adaptive challenge. So normally in our day-to-day leadership lives, we have small scope changes and challenges that we have to meet, but we, for the most part, know how to go about doing them. Right? Those are in leadership theory, we call those a mechanical fix. Those are things that we know what we need to do, we need to go about it, or we at least know how to figure out how to do it. And those are sort of mechanical day-to-day fixes that we go through on a regular basis. Something like COVID, the scope is much, much broader and the impact is much, much broader. And that's called an adaptive challenge. So I just thought I would start off by asking you, what has been the most challenging part of COVID for you? Now, your answer may not be on my list, but the list that I came up with was the change that you're facing, the workload that you're facing, the uncertainty that you're facing, the conflict you may be facing, the level of distress you may be facing, or of course, all of the above. Could be all of the above for sure. So what personally have you found the most challenging part of COVID? Okay, I'm going to give you a couple more seconds to vote, and then we'll close it out. Okay, going once, going twice, sold. All right, so this is what you guys have said. So the uncertainty is what you're finding the most challenging part. Absolutely, right? The uncertainty makes it really difficult to manage. We don't know how long we're dealing with this. The guidelines are changing all the time. It's just really difficult. The workload can be, lots of people are struggling with. It's funny because some people are struggling with way too much workload and other people are struggling with way too little. So it's sort of a bifurcated model there. Change and conflict are absolutely challenges. And then of course, all of the above, all at the same time. And some of you may have sort of the emotional distress, just the stress about it, either with the people yourself or with the people that you're working with. So there's lots of reasons why it's very, very challenging. So an adaptive challenge is essentially when all of a sudden the things that we take for granted are upended. Our beliefs are challenged. What we, all of a sudden, what we once thought was safe, we can no longer take for granted. All of the ways in which we normally go about solving problems are less effective or need to be changed. And there's legitimate and competing perspectives that emerge in a situation like this because nobody knows what is the right path. So these are adaptive challenges are systemic problems or challenges with no ready answers. There's no routines on how to do this because we haven't faced it before. So the big challenge for leaders when you're facing kind of adaptive challenges, how do you mobilize people to do the work of that they really don't feel they know how to do, of doing the adaptive work? So typically, when we're dealing with our day-to-day lives and we've got our mechanical fixes and we know our routines and whatnot are stable, we can very easily as leaders focus on the managerial aspects of our work. We're managing we're managing and organizing and controlling and problem solving in a very predictable kind of way. And I think that adaptive challenges really throw you heavily into the leadership side of your work, but you still got to get the managerial piece done too, right? Which is partly where the workload becomes a challenge. But what I think these adaptive challenges focus us to do is we need to, as leaders, pull ourselves out of managerial mode and focus on leadership mode, which means managing change, focusing on things like setting directives, establishing new visions, communicating to align people, and just motivating and inspiring people to keep going in the face of great uncertainty. So the researchers who talk about the work of leadership, there's a really interesting HBR article if you're interested in this stuff. Heise and Laurie, they argue that there's a couple of strategies that are helpful to do this work of managing adaptive change. You've got to be asking tough questions of people. You have to support people in their need to adapt their job and their work life and their personal lives. And you have to be comfortable with people being disoriented with relationships. You have to be comfortable with drawing out conflict, because in identifying conflict, you will understand some of the ideas and perspectives and issues that come up. And you essentially have to challenge the way you do business, right? And that's what an adaptive challenge is all about, is challenging the way you do business. So that's sort of the scope of the work that adaptive challenges force us to do. So an adaptive challenge like COVID sort of expands this level of work that we have to do at a deeper level. So some of the strategies that they argue is always take the big picture perspective first. Try to get a big picture perspective. And in their work, they refer to that as a process of getting on the balcony. So trying to get a big picture perspective on what's going on. It's really easy to get stuck in the weeds, but you need to get a big picture perspective on what's going on to identify what's the issue. Take the time to figure out what is the adaptive challenge, because I mean, obviously COVID has prompted it, but each organization is going to have a specific challenge within that they need to focus on. So whether it's, COVID has disrupted my business model, to, COVID has decimated my revenue stream, like those sorts of things. What exactly is the adaptive challenge that you need to work through? Adaptive challenges cause a lot of distress for people. And one of the big challenges of being a leader is to figure out how to regulate that distress. You need to honor it and acknowledge that it's there. But you also need to make sure that people are able to work through it and be productive. So keeping people on track despite the fact that they're feeling distressed. And a lot of the solution they propose to that is to actually get people working directly on the adaptive piece of it. So use those people to do a lot of the work and bring forward a lot of ideas that you may not normally do as part of your process. So consider getting a lot of more input from people more than you typically might. And one of their final recommendations is to, when you're facing these kinds of adaptive challenges, you really want to hear of the voices of leaders from below, because those people know a lot of what's going on. And you as a leader, you need to be thinking about what are the great ideas, what are the perspectives, and what are the challenges that I may not even be aware of. How do I hear those? How do I find out so that I'm making informed decisions going forward? So make sure that people feel that they're able to speak up. Essentially, they can voice things. So all of this that it's a lot of work being a leader in an adaptive challenge. You've got to figure out how to essentially reshape your vision for your organization as you work through, and then how to turn that vision into action. So one of the big ideas that people also have in these times is people want to know, like, why should I get behind you in particular? So I'm feeling distressed and stressed, and then we're facing a lot of change. Why should I follow you? So one of the I think important messages in this time is that leaders need to consider sharing more. Authentic leadership is the idea that we are genuine people, and we are people who are able to share fully who we are as leaders with our people. So authentic leadership is the idea that leaders are genuine, that they're original, they're not trying to be somebody that they're not or copy somebody, and that authentic leaders are motivated by their own personal convictions. So these are leaders who are good at telling their personal story, explaining why they have the beliefs that they have, and really doing a lot to communicate with people. And there's a lot of components to authentic leadership that I won't go into just in the interest of time, but I think one of the key components of authentic leadership is the notion that we accept that leaders are not perfect, that leaders have strengths and weaknesses, and that one of the effective ways to get people to build trust, particularly in times when they're distressed, is to selectively but honestly share our own leadership weaknesses and reveal who we actually are. So to the extent that people can relate and identify with leaders, it's easier to feel, yes, I can be led by somebody like this. Right? I can trust this person, and I can be led by them, and I want to follow them. The other thing that's important, I think, in terms of sort of leadership character approaches is some of the character traits, sort of traditional character traits that are often not associated with strong leaders, can be very, very powerful here. An example would be humility. So particularly in an adaptive challenge, leaders have to be humble because they don't know the answers any more than anybody else does. So character traits like patience, like humility, like kindness, things that we don't always immediately associate with big L leadership, are really important here. So don't be afraid to share that. Don't be afraid to show your weaknesses and the fact that you don't have all the answers, because nobody expects you to, and it's okay to talk about it. One of my favorite views about transformational leadership that I think applies a lot to the COVID situation is transformational leadership. So transformational leadership is the idea that leaders who clearly communicate a strong vision that is appealing to their followers can get people behind them in a really, really deeply committed way. And it can be very, very powerful in terms of building performance. There are 4 sort of how-to facets to transformational leadership. They're called the 4 I's, and they're 4 behaviors that leaders who use this kind of style demonstrate. The first one is called idealized influence. And it's the idea that leaders have to serve as really strong, positive role models. So these are people, idealized influence, are people who walk the talk, right? They do what they tell others to do. They behave the way they want others to behave. So they're really strong role models. The next I is inspirational motivation, and this is about the crux of transformational leadership. Is really about articulating a appealing vision that people can get behind. So one of the important pieces about communicating that kind of vision is that it builds self-efficacy. It builds collective efficacy as well. So belief that people can get there. Intellectual stimulation is the idea that leaders are responsible for developing people's creativity, for engaging in critical thinking, like pushing people to really critically examine maybe assumptions or information or data that they may have relied on in the past that needs some challenging. So they're trying to challenge people intellectually. And then the last one is called individualized consideration. And this is really about the idea that you need to get to know your followers and you need to express genuine concern and genuine connection with them. So this can be small acts of kindness, it can be reaching out to people, but when people feel connected to their leader, that can be a really powerful thing. So transformational leadership is really about building on the idea that people need a vision to get behind. They want to contribute and participate. They need to be challenged to contribute and participate. And this can be, I think, one of the most powerful leadership styles in a situation like COVID, where you're facing really strong adaptive challenges. How am I doing for time? Okay, I'm going to wrap up pretty soon, so we'll get to the end. But I have just a couple of other bits about relationships between leaders and their teams. So there's a perspective called leader-member exchange theory that argues that one of the biggest jobs that leaders have to have is to build positive relationships with all of their followers individually. So that leadership is really about the relationship that leaders and followers build together. And one of the things that this theory argues is that leaders and followers tend to have people with whom they have stronger relationships and people with whom they have weaker relationships. So one of the things that leaders need to do is try to reach out to the group with whom they tend to have weaker relationships and strengthen those, but also to make sure that you're actually listening to people, they call it the out group, but to people who are you may have weaker relationships with. We tend to, as leaders, according to this theory, we have an in-group, the people we're comfortable with and we have really strong relationships with. But there's also an out-group. And we need to recognize that as leaders, we may not be as comfortable reaching out to the out-group, but those people have important insights and they have important perspectives that we need to know as well. So one of the things that I would recommend is to make sure you are considering the importance of reaching out to the out-group and hearing what they have to say for your success going forward. The last perspective I will say before we wrap up is that some people think about leadership. We tend to think about leadership as leaders on top and followers on the bottom. Another way is to flip that on its head, and that's a perspective called servant leadership, which really argues that the role of leaders is to fundamentally support followers in their development through their organizational lives and their personal lives. So the role of leaders is to fundamentally develop and serve their followers first and foremost. So it sort of flips the orientation on its head. And so servant leaders are people who are really concerned about developing their followers. They empower their followers. They try to make sure that they're creating as much value for their follower community as they possibly can. So it's really about the focus of a servant leader is about on others. It's focusing on others. And one of the things that the research shows is that servant leadership is not only good for developing organizational performance and team performance, but it's also a good way to develop impact on society, to broaden impact on society. Because when you're developing people and making sure that they're flourishing the best that they can be, those people go out into society and do the same thing to others. So it can have a sort of trickle up effect, so to speak. So I think that that's a particularly important perspective on leadership at this point in time. Lastly, if you, I don't have time to share a TED Talk with you, but if you have never seen my all-time favorite TED Talk by Drew Dudley called Everyday Leadership, I highly recommend it. He has a really down-to-earth view on leadership, and he says essentially that his view of leadership is that leadership is the everyday act of improving each other's lives. So it's what I call small L leadership rather than big L leadership. And I think that is a really important perspective at this point too. What can we do as leaders each and every day to do small acts of improving each other's lives? Whether it makes our work easier or just makes our day better, or whatever it is that we can do to help people out in a small way each and every day, and show a sort of small L leadership each and every day. I think that's an important perspective in terms of coping on a day-to-day basis right now. So Michael Jordan put it, earn your leadership every day. So each and every day you're earning your leadership. So some of these theories have sort of started with the self and the importance of taking care of yourself as you cope through COVID before you take care of others. And we sort of moved to looking at how can we manage change and how can we foster change as we go through adapting to what is a huge adaptive change. My last question for you is, which of these theories resonates with you the most during your COVID challenges? So the ones I put up, we've got authentic leadership, transformational leadership, leader-member exchange, servant leadership, everyday leadership, or all of the above. You get to pick. Okay, so there's some people who are Dudley fans like me, who like everyday leadership, servant leadership for sure, focusing on developing others. Great, and all of the above. So I do think one of the reasons why I tried to share a little bit of a bunch of different theories with you is I think they all have their nuggets, their little bits of wisdom that you can think about on your day-to-day. So hopefully there was a digestible little nugget from each piece that you can think about what resonates with you. Okay, I'm going to close off the voting there, and I just have one thing to wrap up with. So my takeaways for you are, COVID is an adaptive challenge for leaders, for sure. There's no question about it. Many of you have experienced adaptive challenges before, so consider the fact that you have gone through other ones before, and you will again, but this is the one we're facing right now. Recognize that those are associated with distress for various reasons and all kinds of different distress. Distress is everywhere. So people are hurting to some extent, people are stressed, and you might have experienced more conflict than usual. Distress is everywhere, and just be aware of that and recognize that that's one of the jobs that we have to manage as leaders. Sometimes reaching out and just saying, accepting who your shortcomings as a leader is a good way for people to understand where you're coming from and to build trust. So share who you are in an authentic way. Don't be afraid to have people perceive you badly. Share who you are, who you legitimately are, even your shortcomings, because people are also looking for ways to help other people out. So it makes people feel good. So sharing shortcomings and weaknesses can really be a good way to build trust in your team. Think about what can you do in terms of communicating some sort of inspiring vision for this period of time, or that your team can get behind. What can you get some commitment to? What can you inspire people to commit to, despite the fact that there's lots of challenges associated with that? Think on a day-to-day basis about how can you build your team's confidence and their efficacy about their ability to cope, and the fact that we will get through all of this together. So how can you build people's self-efficacy and group efficacy? Reach out to people, not just your in-group, reach out to people who are in your out-group, truly listen to them, because they may have perspectives that you're missing that you need to know about sooner rather than later. And that could be very helpful. And you can also build those relationships with your out-group. who could eventually become your in-group and important members of that. And then think about how you are being of service to people and developing people and helping people get through each and every day. So think small L leadership, not just big L leadership. Okay, I'm sorry I went over time, but I do have time for some questions if there are any. There's so much in leadership theory to talk about. So I wasn't sure about the timing, but thank you very much for your participation in the polls. And I'm happy to take any questions that we have for the time that we have remaining. Thank you very much for attending today. I will get these slides out to Amanda, who can send them out to the team.
Yes, thank you. That was a great presentation. Thank you for sharing that with us. So the slides are available at the Workplace Reimagined trade show booth. So we already have them organized for the group, so you can find them there. Contact information is on the screen there as well, if you're interested and for follow-up. So thank you for providing that. Lots to think about and take in and draw from as we implement and integrate theories and leadership every day.
Yes,
as we navigate
everyday activity for sure.
Every day, absolutely. So thank you to everyone who has attended. If there is, we have 4 minutes. So if there are questions, please enter them. There's lots of messages of thanks and appreciation for the presentation in the chat. If you're wanting to, if you can see that and follow through, so very insightful. And maybe if there aren't any questions in the chat, I'll just have one, is how do you go about, or where do you start integrating across the theories to bring them together into kind of an everyday practice?
I think I would recommend starting with what resonates with you. What motivates you? What is the approach that really resonates you? It speaks to you, and that sort of speaks to what kind of leader that you want to be, and that's a really good starting point, I think. And then I think once you're comfortable with sort of the pieces that really come intuitively, and you've built on that, and you feel you've got some good skill set there, I would say that then you need to start thinking about what are the other kinds of approaches or styles that I'm not as drawn to, but I might need that in my toolbox at some point. Because the one thing that I can say about leadership theories and what we know about leadership is there's no right answer for across all situations. There's always, leadership is fundamentally about adaptation, and you need to be able to adapt, and you need to be able to use different styles at different times. So think about how can you expand your toolbox from what you're comfortable with, the things that appeal to you, the things that come naturally to you. How can you start thinking about how you could develop skills, or when you might want to need to use styles that are a little bit outside of your comfort zone. Because there will be times when those styles are very appropriate, and you might want to have thought in advance about when you might want to pull out something that's very, very different from your typical approach. Yeah. So that's where I would start with your comfort zone and sort of build out and work that way.
Okay, well, that's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shannon. I appreciate your help. Thank you very much for having me today.